It looked like the fans spoke. It looks like the fans said, hell no, we won't go. Hell no, we won't go. Caitlin Clark fans clearly no showing the Indiana Fever versus the Las Vegas Aces. It was smack dab empty. It would cost you more to get a small fry with no burger and no drink than it would have cost to sit in the 100 section in the lower bowl. This is crazy. The Las Vegas Aces got absolutely smacked.
Something wild happened at a WNBA game recently, and it wasn't on the court. The Indiana Fever faced off against the Las Vegas Aces, and the arena looked like a ghost town. We're talking seats open everywhere, upper bowl, lower bowl, sidelines, all of it. And here's the part that'll really get you. Tickets in the lower section were going for less than the price of a small fry at a fast food spot. No burger, no drink, just fries. That's how little demand there was. The Fever won the game convincingly, 84-68, but nobody was there to see it. And the reason? Caitlin Clark wasn't playing. The fans didn't just stay home. They sent a message. The question is anyone in the Fever organization actually listening?
We gonna get into the game, but before we even get into that, look at this. I mean, damn. The fans officially, you can look at how empty it is in here. Just look at how empty it is in here, man. The fans officially no-showed. They officially no-showed this game. They no-showed this game, you guys. They wanted nothing to do with this. You can see all of these empty seats. I mean, just damn. Just damn. I'm going to get into this one too. Take a look at this. You look at all these empty seats just right here. I mean, it's empty seats. Look, I'm going to zoom in for you guys. It is empty seats everywhere, guys. Everywhere. Bad. Real bad. Hold on. Let me get that sound out of there. I don't want to. Look at this. Look at how empty it is in here, man.
There's a difference between a quiet crowd and an empty building. And what went down at this Fever versus Aces game was the latter. Row after row of open seats stretched across the arena like something out of a preseason scrimmage nobody asked for. And this wasn't a random Tuesday night matchup between two lottery teams. This was the Indiana Fever, one of the most talked about franchises in women's basketball right now, going up against the Las Vegas Aces, a team that's been one of the premier organizations in the WNBA for years. But none of that mattered when Caitlin Clark's name wasn't on the injury report as questionable. It was just flat out absent. And the fans responded accordingly. They didn't protest with signs. They didn't flood social media with angry posts, at least not in the way you'd expect. They simply didn't show up.
All these seats is open. You got some fans down there, but it's just seats everywhere, man. The fans officially no-showed. They no-showed. Look at this. All these empty seats. Just seats everywhere. Seats everywhere. All these joints. I mean, come on, man. The fans have officially spoke. They're not going if CC ain't out there. Like, it is what it is. Y'all know, Caitlin Clark, Indiana Fever fans travel on the road. Now, it was still fans there that got some autographs from Caitlin and all of that. She's always going to have some fans show up.
And in sports, nothing sends a louder message than an empty seat. Now, to be fair, there were still some fans who made the trip. A small but dedicated group showed up and got autographs from players like Sophie Cunningham and Raven Johnson, who are always solid with the supporters who do come out. But that core group of Caitlin Clark fans, the ones who travel across state lines, who sell out arenas in opposing cities, who turn road games into home games for the Fever, they were gone. Completely gone. And you can't overstate what that means. The Caitlin Clark effect on attendance has been one of the most documented and debated stories in women's sports over the past 2 years.
You know, look at this stuff. I want everyone to notice how much harder Indiana players play when Caitlin is out. Do you think the coach has divided the locker room and has players convinced Caitlin Clark basketball is not the way forward? It seems they play with more effort and energy when CC is out. And this is what I'm saying. It just Stephanie White wants this to be the Kelsey Mitchell show. And this team, they drafted Raven Johnson. This team is built to play without Caitlin Clark. I was under the assumption, and hey, clearly I was wrong. I was under the assumption that the job here was to win with Caitlin Clark and to build around Caitlin Clark. They are clearly decided to go in another direction, which is why they need to just end this thing.
Before going further, if you're enjoying this video, don't forget to smash that subscribe button. It really helps us keep bringing you the content you love. Share this video with your friends so they don't miss out on all the drama and excitement.
Arenas that used to struggle to draw a few thousand fans were suddenly packed when Indiana came to town. Ticket prices were surging, broadcasts were pulling in record numbers. All of that was tied directly to one player. So when that player sits and the building looks like it does in those photos, rows and rows of empty red seats with nobody in them, it forces a real conversation about what the Fever actually have when Clark isn't on the floor. The fans made their position crystal clear. They're not buying what's being sold without her. And the next question becomes whether the people running this franchise are going to acknowledge that reality or keep pretending it doesn't exist. Because here's the thing, the Fever won. They won convincingly, and somehow the empty seats still managed to overshadow everything that happened in the actual game. That should tell you everything you need to know about where things stand right now in Indianapolis.
And this is why you got Andrea Carter and them talking like this.
Call this Biggie Smalls because Caitlin Clark is having a phenomenal year, 20 points, 8 assists. But how do they really keep things going? Well, they have a big three and they step up in big moments.
Caitlin Clark is having a big year, but how do they really keep things going? It's Aaliyah Boston and Kelsey Mitchell, clearly, right?
Aaliyah Boston, all-star starter, so many votes. Love this for her, but most importantly, I love her growth when it comes to the string. Nice little dish out, but then she gets the ball out. 9 times out of 10 before, she used to go to the basket on well. It's her assisting. So
Kelsey Mitchell gets down the floor. 3 seconds off the shot clock, and she is already down the floor in attack mode. If she hunts the basket, now 5 seasons. She is consistent. Hunting shots in transition will be huge.
She hunting shots, all right. She's hunting shots. So, you got ESPN pretty much promoting Biggie Smalls. That's the new term. That's the new name for Kelsey Mitchell and Aaliyah Boston. And, the Indiana Fever have clearly built this team in a different – they built this team in a direction that is not around Caitlin Clark. And that's just the truth. That's just the truth.
On paper, Indiana Fever 84, Las Vegas Aces 68 looks like a comfortable win, and it was. But the way it happened and who made it happen is where things get really interesting. Kelsey Mitchell was the story of this game. 37 minutes, 27 points, 3 assists, and this was her 3rd consecutive game with 25 or more points. 3 straight. She's been locked in like this for weeks now, and the Fever have been riding that wave hard. Now, she didn't shoot it efficiently. 7 of 18 from the field and 3 of 9 from three-point range puts her at right around 33%, which isn't exactly a shooting clinic. But Mitchell found another way to get her buckets. She attacked the free throw line relentlessly and converted 10 of 12 attempts. And that's where she really padded the stat line. When you're getting to the line that consistently you don't need to shoot lights out from the floor, you're making the defense pay either way. Aaliyah Boston had what you'd call a tale of 2 halves. The first half was rough. Missed layups, timing issues, just one of those stretches where nothing seems to click no matter how open you are. But the second half was a completely different story. Boston turned it on when it mattered and finished with 18 points and 10 rebounds while posting a plus 16 rating. 3 or 4 from the three-point line in the second half alone. She was aggressive, she was physical, and she made the Aces pay every time they let her get comfortable in the paint. Sophie Cunningham, the blonde bomber as some fans have started calling her, is genuinely on fire from 3 right now. 3 of 5 from deep and 9 points in this one, continuing a stretch where she's been one of the more reliable shooters on this roster. Lexi Hall chipped in 10 points on 5 of 10 shooting and grabbed 4 rebounds. Solid, efficient, no wasted possessions. And then there's Ty Harris, 4 points in 26 minutes. 4. The Fever keep trotting her out there and keep putting meaningful minutes behind her name, but the production just isn't there. She's not creating off the dribble at a high level. She's not making things happen defensively in ways that change games. And 4 points in 26 minutes against a Las Vegas team playing without its best player is just not acceptable. The Fever have options, and continuing to give Harris that kind of run when she's producing at that level is a conversation the coaching staff really needs to have internally. Raven Johnson played a genuinely solid game and continues to look like someone who belongs in this league. The young guard is developing in real time, and you can see the confidence growing every time she steps on the floor. She's one of the more encouraging parts of what Indiana is building when you can figure out exactly what they're building. Overall, this was a wire-to-wire type performance where Indiana controlled tempo, controlled the paint, and never really let the Aces feel like they were in the game. The final score could have been even wider if the Fever had pushed harder in the fourth quarter, but 8-4, 6-8 gets the job done, and it keeps Indiana moving in the right direction in the standings. If you want to understand just how dependent the Las Vegas Aces are on A'ja Wilson, watch any game she doesn't play in. This was one of those games, and it was not pretty. Without Wilson, the Aces looked disjointed, unfocused, and frankly outclassed by an Indiana team that was itself missing its biggest star. The energy was off from the opening tip. The execution on both ends was shaky, and the individual performances from players who are supposed to step up in Wilson's absence were, with a few exceptions, genuinely disappointing. Chelsea Gray was the most glaring example, 2 of 11 from the field. 2. For a veteran point guard of her caliber, that's a performance that's hard to explain away as just an off night. Gray has looked physically limited for stretches this season, slower in transition, less explosive when trying to create off the pick and roll, and less capable of getting into the paint the way she used to. When she's healthy and locked in, she's one of the best point guards in the league. Right now, she doesn't look like that player. She looked like she was fighting her own body out there, and the Aces offense suffered for it every single possession she was on the floor. Jalen July was 3 of 9 and largely invisible for long stretches of the game, and this has been a recurring issue for July. There's a real conversation to be had about whether she's living up to the expectations placed on her. For a player with her physical tools and the platform she's been given, the efficiency numbers just haven't been there consistently enough to silence the critics. And then there's Kennedy Carter, and this is the story that nobody seems to be talking about loudly enough. Earlier this season, Kennedy Carter was one of the most exciting bench players in the entire WNBA. She was averaging 20 points off the bench. 20. She was attacking the basket, creating her own shot, making defenses account for her every time she stepped on the floor. She was a problem. Then something happened. Reports suggest that Carter commented on a social media post that was critical of Aces coach Hammond, something along the lines of suggesting the coaching staff was holding her back, that she was still producing despite being under what she described as constraints. And ever since that post surfaced and the attention followed, Kennedy Carter has looked like a completely different player. 0 points in this game. 0. 2 shot attempts. She's not looking at the rim. She's not attacking. She's not hunting her shot the way she was earlier in the year. It's like someone turned off a switch and the player who was lighting up box scores every night simply disappeared. Now, it's all speculation as to exactly what's happening behind the scenes. The team hasn't addressed it publicly, and Carter hasn't elaborated on her earlier comments. But the timing is impossible to ignore. Something shifted. And whatever it is has completely derailed one of the more compelling individual stories of this WNBA season. Jackie Young gave the Aces something to work with. She was one of the few players who competed with any real intensity and showed up on both ends of the floor. But one player carrying the load against a motivated Indiana team isn't a formula for success, and the final score reflected that reality in full. The Aces, at their best with A'ja Wilson healthy and commanding the paint, are one of the most dangerous teams in the league. Without her, they look like a roster that doesn't quite know its own identity, and that's a problem that goes beyond one bad game. Let's slow down here and really talk about Kennedy Carter, because what's happening with her is one of the most quietly disturbing storylines in women's basketball this season, and it's not getting nearly enough attention. Go back to the early part of this season. Kennedy Carter was electric. Every time she came off that bench, you felt it. The energy changed. Defenses had to adjust. She was relentless going to the basket. She had touch on her mid-range game, and she was finishing through contact in ways that had people asking whether she should have been in the starting lineup all along. 20 points per game off the bench isn't just good, it's special. It's the kind of production that earns you a reputation around the league as someone opposing coaches specifically game plan for. And then, if the reports are accurate, she made the mistake of letting her frustration go public. The post in question was on social media. Carter allegedly commented on content that was critical of Aces head coach Becky Hammon, suggesting that even with the constraints she was operating under, she was still finding ways to produce. It wasn't a full-blown call-out. It wasn't a press conference moment. It was a comment on a post. But in a league where rosters are small, relationships between coaches and players are intense, and front offices watch everything. A comment like that can have consequences that extend far beyond the original words. Now, to be clear, this is all speculative based on what's circulating in fan communities and commentary circles. The Aces organization hasn't confirmed anything. Carter hasn't spoken about it directly in any widely reported interview. But the timing of her production cliff is almost impossible to dismiss as coincidence. She went from one of the most productive bench players in the league to a player who doesn't even look at the basket during games. 0 points, 2 shot attempts. That's not an off night, that's a pattern. And patterns tell stories. What makes this even more compelling is the broader conversation it opens up about player autonomy and coaching dynamics in the WNBA. The league has grown enormously in visibility over the past few years, and with that growth has come increased scrutiny on how franchises treat their players, how coaches manage personalities, and how organizations respond when internal tensions become even slightly public. If what's being said about Carter is even partially accurate, it raises real questions about whether the Aces are managing this situation in a way that's fair to one of their more talented contributors. Carter is young. She has real ability, and watching her disappear from the game the way she has these last several weeks is genuinely hard to watch for anyone who saw what she was capable of earlier this season. Whatever is happening behind those closed doors in Las Vegas, it's affecting a player's career in real time. And that's a story worth paying attention to, regardless of how it ultimately gets resolved. Here's where things get uncomfortable, at least for anyone who's been paying close attention to how Caitlin Clark's role on the Indiana Fever is being discussed publicly. ESPN ran a segment recently that was essentially a love letter to what they're now calling Biggie Smalls, the pairing of Kelsey Mitchell and Aaliyah Boston as the true engine of the Indiana Fever. The segment highlighted Mitchell's ability to get downhill in transition, Boston's growth as a passer and interior presence, and framed the two of them as the real pillars of Indiana's success this season. And look, Mitchell and Boston are both excellent players. That's not the debate. Mitchell has been spectacular over this recent stretch, and Boston's development has been one of the genuine bright spots of the Fever's trajectory over the last couple of years. Recognizing what they bring to this team isn't wrong. But here's what's worth noting about how that segment was constructed. Clark's name was mentioned almost as an afterthought. She was acknowledged, the numbers were briefly referenced, 20 points and 8 assists being the kind of stat line that would make almost any other player in the league the centerpiece of every broadcast. And then the conversation immediately pivoted back to Mitchell and Boston as the real drivers of what Indiana is doing. When the fourth largest sports media company in the world starts constructing a narrative that essentially minimizes the contributions of the most watched player in women's basketball history, that's not an accident. That's editorial. That's a choice. And it aligns perfectly with what's been playing out on the court and in the lineup decisions that Stephanie White has been making throughout this season. The Biggie Smalls branding is clever. It's catchy. It gives the media something to latch onto and repeat, but it also serves a very specific purpose. It makes the argument that the Fever have an identity that exists independently of Caitlin Clark. And if the organization is going to continue moving in the direction the recent games suggest they're heading, having that narrative already in circulation in mainstream sports media is very convenient. On the broadcast side, commentators Andrea Carter and Chinny Agam handled this game in a way that reportedly felt almost deliberately Clark-free. For a player of Clark's stature, Rookie of the Year, record-breaking gate draw, face of a franchise transformation, to barely register in the broadcast conversation during a game her team is playing in, even in absentia, is strange. It's the kind of thing that makes you wonder whether the framing around this team is being coordinated in ways that go beyond what any one broadcaster would decide on their own. This is all worth watching as the season continues, because narratives in sports media have a way of becoming self-fulfilling. Once the Fever are better without Clark's story gets enough oxygen, it starts to influence how games are evaluated, how lineups are justified, and ultimately how front office decisions are made. And right now, that story is getting a lot of oxygen. This is the question that's been quietly building all season and is now impossible to ignore after back-to-back wins without their most famous player on the floor. When Clark went down, the assumption for most observers was simple. The Fever would struggle, they'd get through it, and everyone would count the days until she returned. That's the natural expectation when your most impactful player misses games. But that's not what's happened. Indiana has won, and they haven't just scraped by, they've dominated games, played with purpose, and looked in certain stretches like a team that knows exactly what it's doing. And that started a conversation that nobody in the organization seems eager to have publicly. Was this team designed to function without Caitlin Clark? Look at the roster construction. Raven Johnson is a press and attack point guard who thrives in up-tempo situations and creates chaos defensively. Kelsey Mitchell is a volume scorer who can carry a team's offense on her back. Aaliyah Boston is a versatile forward who can score in the post, step out to the three-point line, and facilitate out of the high post. Sophie Cunningham spaces the floor. Lexi Hall provides interior depth. This is a complete, coherent unit that has a style and an identity. And that identity is not built around a 6-foot point guard who operates as a primary playmaker and floor general. Clark's game is unique. She needs the ball in her hands. She needs spacing that works for her shot selection. She needs a system where her decision-making and court vision are the focal point of the offense rather than complementary pieces to someone else's initiative. The Fever, as currently constructed and as currently coached by Stephanie White, don't appear to be running that system. Now, maybe that was always the plan and nobody said it out loud. Maybe the front office made the calculation that they could build a playoff competitive team around Mitchell and Boston, draft pieces that complement that core, and figure out the Clark situation as it evolved. Or maybe the coaching staff genuinely tried to integrate Clark into this system and found that the fit was harder than anticipated. Either way, what we're watching now looks less like a team missing its star player and more like a team playing exactly the way it was designed to play. There are people close to the situation who've pointed out on social media and in fan forums that Indiana's players seem to play with a distinctly different energy when Clark isn't on the floor. More aggressive, more cohesive, more free. That could mean a lot of things. It could mean the system fits better without her. It could mean the team is playing looser without the weight of expectation that follows Clark everywhere she goes. It could mean something more uncomfortable about locker room dynamics. What it almost certainly means is that there's a fundamental misalignment between what Caitlin Clark brings to a basketball team and what the Indiana Fever are trying to be. And that misalignment if it doesn't get addressed directly and soon, is going to define this franchise for years in ways that nobody in Indianapolis is going to enjoy. A few months ago, suggesting that the Indiana Fever should trade Caitlin Clark would have gotten you laughed out of any serious sports conversation. She was the Rookie of the Year. She was the reason the WNBA was pulling in television ratings that the league hadn't seen in decades. She was the centerpiece of a franchise revival story that had Indiana fans showing up in numbers the organization had never experienced before. But sports are funny, and the conversation has shifted. The argument being made in certain circles, including by some pretty loud voices in the Fever fan community, is that the kindest thing the Indiana Fever could do for Caitlin Clark at this point is let her go somewhere that actually wants to build around her. Not around her fame, not around her marketability, around her game, around the specific things she does on a basketball court that make her different from every other player in the league. Because here's the reality, there are franchises in this league that would restructure everything around Caitlin Clark tomorrow if given the chance. Teams that would hire coaches whose systems are designed to maximize what she does. Teams that would surround her with players who complement her rather than compete with her for the ball and for the identity of the offense. Teams in markets that would absolutely erupt if Clark showed up in their city. Los Angeles has been mentioned in speculation. And look, whether or not that specific destination ever becomes reality, the concept isn't crazy. A team with Clark running the offense, spacing around her, with a coach who understands how to deploy her skill set would be a genuine championship contender. The talent is undeniable. The question has always been whether she's in the right environment to let that talent fully express itself. In Indiana right now, based on everything we're seeing, the answer appears to be no. The system doesn't fit. The coaching philosophy doesn't align with how Clark plays, and now the wins without her are starting to give the organization an excuse to not confront that reality directly. The counterargument is real though, and it deserves to be acknowledged. Trades in the WNBA are complicated. The league is small. The salary structures are different from the NBA, and the optics of trading away the most marketable player in your franchise's history, a player who directly drove a significant portion of your revenue growth over the past year and a half, are genuinely terrible no matter how you spin it. The backlash from Clark's fan base alone would be historically loud. But sometimes the most uncomfortable decision is also the most correct one. And the question of where Caitlin Clark plays her basketball for the next decade matters enormously, not just for her personally, but for the WNBA as a whole. Getting that right is more important than avoiding a difficult conversation in the short term. The fans who no-showed this game in protest understand that intuitively. They're not just reacting emotionally, they're signaling that the product being offered without Clark isn't one they're interested in consuming. And in professional sports, where the entire business model depends on people showing up and tuning in, that signal deserves a serious response. Before anyone starts writing the Indiana Fever are a championship contender without Caitlin Clark headlines, it's worth taking a hard look at the context surrounding these recent wins. The Las Vegas Aces that Indiana beat in this game were missing Aaliyah Wilson, who is arguably the best player in the entire WNBA. Aaliyah Wilson changes everything for that team. The spacing, the defensive attention she commands, the physicality in the paint, the leadership on the floor. Without her, the Aces are a fundamentally different and significantly diminished team. Beating them in that state tells you something about Indiana's quality, but it doesn't tell you everything. And before this game, the Fever also took down the Los Angeles Sparks in a game where Kelsey Plum wasn't playing and Cameron Brink was out. The Sparks were running out a lineup that featured players who, in some cases, were recent roster additions brought in to fill gaps created by injuries. Winning that game is nice. It counts as a W in the standings, but it's not a measuring stick for how this Fever team performs when the competition is at full strength. This isn't an argument that Indiana's wins are illegitimate. They're not. You play the team in front of you, you execute the game plan, you get the victory. That's how sports work. But the broader narrative being constructed around these performances needs to be held to a standard of intellectual honesty that some of the more enthusiastic Fever don't need Clark commentary is currently lacking. When this Indiana team beats a healthy Las Vegas Aces squad, or a full-strength New York Liberty, or a Seattle Storm with all their pieces in place, that's when you can make real claims about what this roster is capable of without its most famous player. Until then, the results are encouraging, but the sample size and the context demand caution. What these wins do tell us is that Indiana has real players. Mitchell is legitimate. Boston is legitimate. The supporting cast has improved meaningfully. This isn't a one-player team that falls apart the moment that player sits. There's substance here, and that's worth acknowledging. But substance in a depleted field is different from substance on the biggest stages. And the Indiana Fever, if they're serious about competing for a championship rather than just padding a winning record during a soft stretch, need to reckon with what their roster actually looks like when it matters most and who they want leading the charge when the games stop being comfortable. Everything that happened around this Indiana Fever versus Las Vegas Aces game, the empty arena, the blowout win, the ESPN narrative push, the player dynamics, the continued absence of the league's most marketable star, all of it points to the same uncomfortable truth. The Indiana Fever are at a crossroads, and the decisions they make in the coming weeks and months are going to define this franchise for a long time. On one side of that crossroads is the path where the organization acknowledges the misalignment between Caitlin Clark's game and the current coaching system, makes the hard adjustments required to build a team that genuinely plays to her strengths, and fully commits to making the Clark era in Indiana what it has the potential to be. That path is harder. It probably requires roster changes, possibly a coaching evolution, and a willingness to subordinate some of what the current core does well in service of something that has a higher ceiling. On the other side is the path where the wins without Clark continue to pile up, the Biggie Smalls narrative grows louder, and the organization gradually, perhaps without ever explicitly saying so, moves in a direction that makes Clark a secondary piece of what they're doing rather than the central figure. That path is easier in the short term, and based on everything we're currently watching, it looks like a path they're already on. The fans who stayed home for this game weren't being dramatic, they were being clear. They invested emotionally and financially in a Caitlin Clark era in Indiana, and what they're seeing right now doesn't look like that era being honored. It looks like it being quietly dismantled. For Clark herself, the situation must be genuinely difficult to navigate. She's one of the most competitive players in the game. She's not the type to publicly air grievances or demand trades, at least not based on anything she's shown so far. But she's also watching everything that's happening in real time. She knows how the team plays differently without her. She knows what the broadcast conversations sound like. She knows what the locker room feels like. And she's a smart enough person to read the situation clearly, even if nobody is saying anything directly. The WNBA needs Caitlin Clark. The league's growth over the past 2 seasons has been extraordinary, and a meaningful portion of that growth runs directly through her presence, her performances, and the cultural conversation she's generated around women's basketball. Fumbling that through poor roster construction, misaligned coaching, or organizational politics that push her out of the situation would be one of the most consequential own goals in the history of this league. What happens next is genuinely anyone's guess. Will she return healthy and immediately reclaim her role as the focal point of everything Indiana does? Will the front office make moves to better align the roster with her skill set? Will the better without Clark narrative become loud enough that it actually influences real decisions? Or will some version of the trade conversation become impossible to ignore? Those are the questions worth sitting with. Because right now, in Indiana, something that started as one of the great stories in women's sports history is starting to look like something a lot more complicated. And the empty seats at that Aces game were the most honest summary of where things stand that anyone has offered all season. The fans spoke. Whether the people making decisions actually heard them is the only question that matters going forward.